November 22, 1942. Kaloch-on-Don. The wind carries frost and the thin, metallic tang of artillery smoke. The frozen dawn runs like a dull ribbon under a sky the color of old lead. You are down among the rubble and the booted, breathing shapes of men who have been pushed too far. In a ruined farmhouse or a shattered dugout, a Soviet soldier brushes snow from the stiff collar of a dead German and finds, inside a sodden breast pocket, a small, battered book, a soldier's diary. The leather is cracked, the ink browned and smeared where cold fingers once clutched a pen. This is not a general's cache of plans. It is the cramped, close-quarters voice of a private, and yet what it will tell the Soviet listeners will be read like prophecy. The collapse of morale, the arithmetic of hunger, and the slow unraveling of an army trapped in a cauldron. The diary's first preserved line in the Soviet file begins on the very night the German spearheads met at Kaloch and closed the Stalingrad Kessel. November 22, left Kaloch at night. What follows day by day is a ledger of retreat and attrition. Russian planes strafe, sleep is a rumor, and marches stretch over sand and frozen ground that rasp the feet raw. We lost a unit, bombs, pilots, artillery, the private writes on November 25, blunt and exhausted. He notes the cold cutting into his body, the relentless shelling, the furtive, hungry calculations men make about tomorrow's bread. When he reaches the dawn's steep bank, he sees the Russians perfectly, not as a distant, heroic enemy, but as human watchers of a broken column. The diary reads like a map of shrinking options. The men leave positions at night, find freezing barns and manure-laden cellars to sleep in, and measure time by the ration, 1/8 of a loaf, then 1/12, then a spoonful of pea soup and a sip of coffee. These numbers have the weight of prophecy. They translate the abstract concept of encircled into mouths and knuckles and stomachs. As the entries fold forward into December, the daily litany becomes unbearable in its ordinary detail. December 1, trenches, mortars, a single tooth of food. December 3, drinking snow, sleeping soaked, cooking horse meat in muddy water. The diary narrows the world to what can be carried on a man's back and what cannot. Boots filled with ice, a toe gone black with frostbite, the hollow stare of a comrade who cannot rise. I haven't eaten in 36 hours, the private admits on November 30. The entries do not measure defeat in grand proclamations, but in the slow sabotage of appetite and faith. He writes in the cold of early December that men are filthy, unshaved. We can barely move. One line, simple and quiet, says everything the generals and dispatches do not. All is lost. The diary's power, in Soviet hands, comes from this intimacy. It is not a chieftain's log nor a staff memorandum. It is the voice of a lance corporal-level soldier detailing the collapse of ordinary courage. His last entries, preserved through December 18, become an elegy. Names and faces, a farewell to a woman called Mitzi, a reaching back to childhood and to Christmas memories that are now obscene against the daily calculus of survival. He writes of writing letters that he knows will probably never reach home. He writes of the diabolical music of battle that never stops. He watches a dead comrade and records the technical detail of his own numbness. It's day now. The sun is shining, but the shells are constantly exploding all around. I am completely exhausted. Is it possible to survive this? The private's language is the simplest, and therefore the most damning. An army cannot be judged only by maps and divisions. It can be judged by the ration cards in a man's pocket and the last cigarette he smokes. When Soviet intelligence, the 7th section of the political department of the 62nd Army, annexed the diary, they did not merely shell the curiosity. Major Alexander Shalubsky, the 62nd Army's Director of Operational Intelligence and a man who spoke fluent German, took the diary and translated sections for his superiors and for the Historical Commission in Stalingrad. Shalubsky's translation was not a quiet scholarly act, it was a weapon. He appended the diary to operational reports on the political and moral state of the German forces arrayed against Choikov's 62nd Army. The diary's quotidian admissions of hunger, theft, frostbite, and broken nerve lines were now raw material, evidence that an elite Wehrmacht was fraying like any other human material under certain pressures. Shalubsky's assessments, appended to the diary translations, described how the army's moral stability deteriorated after the Kessel closed. Thieves and assaults on civilians became commonplace, and letters home were preoccupied with hunger above everything else. The message delivered to Soviet troops and to enemy ears was twofold. The Germans were human, and human beings surrendered when pushed beyond endurance. The diary's rhetorical journey did not end on the airwaves. Shalubsky forwarded assessments to Moscow historians and to higher command, seeking to shape not only enemy perceptions, but also Stalinist narrative. In his reports, he argued that many of the men fighting the 62nd Army were drawn from elite squads and cadre divisions, supposedly the best the Wehrmacht could field, which made their collapse all the more portentous. If disciplined, pure-blooded Aryans could be reduced to the private's cadence of hunger and fear, the Soviet line went, then the entire German project might be less indomitable than Nazi propaganda claimed. The diary's intimate voice was, thus, national in consequence. A single man's cramped handwriting fed into strategic decisions on psychological warfare, leaflet campaigns, and the radio scripts that greeted German ears in the snow. Behind all this lay the wider operational drama of November and December 1942. The diary's opening date, November 22, is the day Operation Uranus's pincers closed, sealing the Sixth Army in a Kessel that would transform the later months into a slow, mechanized death. The entries that record marches, bivouacs in frozen barns, and the arithmetic of rations are not isolated misery. They are the granular evidence of an army's encirclement. The captured private's account dovetailed with other captured documents and prisoner interrogations that indicated a larger truth. The German position in Stalingrad had become tactically precarious and morally raw. When Shalubsky compiled this evidence, he sent through not only the diary, but also synthesized reports that would serve as the raw material for broadcast appeals, encouraging surrender. There is, however, something stubbornly human about the diary that resists the tidy uses of propaganda. The private signs his letters to Mitzi, he names his parents, he replays childhood memories that will not be muddied by political interpretation. In the raw lines, "My poor dear wife and parents," "My sweet sister," "My sweet wife, my blonde Mitzi," you feel the private's identity press against the machine of history. Shalubsky and the propaganda officers could bend and amplify, but they could not entirely erase the note of human gratitude and regret. Those lines, when read on the radio, had a double effect. They undermined the myth of German omnipotence, while reminding listeners, Soviet soldiers and German prisoners alike, that war reduced everyone to the same simple terms: hunger, longing, and the wish to be spared. By the time the diary's excerpts reached print and broadcast, late January 1943 in radio readouts and subsequent Pravda articles, events had already turned sharper and more decisive. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943. The Sixth Army's capitulation was the hinge upon which the entire Eastern Front would begin to swing backward for the Wehrmacht. The private's diary, found in a dead man's pocket weeks earlier, had become more than a record of loss. It was evidence to be wielded in a psychological campaign aimed at peeling away the last layers of resistance in an encircled force.
The Soviets had discovered an instrument more powerful than any leaflet, a first-person testimony that turned suffering into proof.
January 1943. The steppe wind howls like a wounded engine. Across the frozen wastes north of Stalingrad, smoke rises from the ruins of villages now reduced to charcoal and ash. The snow is gray, packed down by boots and tank treads, scarred with frozen footprints that lead nowhere. In a small dugout, reinforced with scavenged planks and sheets of corrugated iron, Major Alexander Shalubsky of the 62nd Army's political department sits under a flickering kerosene lamp. Before him lies the diary, its pages now dry, brittle at the edges, marked with pencil scrawl in a hand that trembles between discipline and despair. The air in the dugout smells of tobacco, sweat, and damp wool. Shalubsky turns each page with the caution of a man handling evidence that might explode. Around him, clerks type on portable machines, their gloves cut at the fingers, their breath fogging the air. Every few minutes, a distant artillery thud sends a vibration through the planks, shaking down flakes of frost from the low ceiling. Outside, the city still burns. Stalingrad's horizon is a jagged smear of smoke and ruin. But here, in this bunker of paper and translation, the war is fought with words. On the table beside the diary lie other spoils of war, letters captured from German soldiers, field orders, ration cards, and the torn front page of a Volscher Beobachter issue boasting victory imminent at Stalingrad. The irony does not escape Shalubsky. He notes it in the margin of his report. Victory, they wrote. But their soldiers eat horse meat and pray for bread. He dips his pen into an ink bottle and begins translating aloud to his aide, Captain Zyanchkovsky. "Listen," Shalubsky mutters, his voice low but cutting through the clatter of typewriters. December 7th. Still no rations. Some men shot themselves last night. We took soup from the horses. The smell of death is everywhere. He pauses. "You hear that, Comrade Captain? This is not a diary. It's a confession." The two men exchange a look. They know what this means. For months, Soviet intelligence had struggled to prove, concretely, documentably, that the German Sixth Army's morale had collapsed beyond repair. Military communiques could claim success, but Stalin demanded evidence that broke the myth of German superiority, evidence that could be broadcast. And now, this diary, this fragile relic from the pocket of a dead soldier, had become exactly that. By midnight, Shalubsky has drafted his first formal memorandum to Chuikov's command staff. The captured diary of a German infantryman provides unequivocal proof of demoralization, hunger, and despair within the Sixth Army. His final entries detail starvation, frostbite, and open rejection of command authority. Recommend dissemination of excerpts through political channels to accelerate surrender sentiment among the enemy. The recommendation passes swiftly through channels. Within days, the diary becomes material for a different battlefield, the psychological front. Soviet radio operators are instructed to broadcast select passages read out loud by a native German speaker, sometimes in calm tones, sometimes with the deliberate tremor of empathy. "Kameraden, we read to you the words of one of your own." Then come the words from the diary, cut from their pages and carried across the airwaves like shrapnel. "We have eaten the horses. We have eaten the dogs. Tomorrow, perhaps we will eat the dead." Each sentence lands differently depending on who hears it. To Soviet soldiers, huddled behind ruined walls and frozen trenches, it sounds like vindication, the proof that their suffering has meaning. To German sentries, crouched in their snowbound bunkers, it sounds like an echo of their own thoughts, too intimate, too close to ignore. In a captured position near the Red October factory, a Soviet sniper named Sergeant Ivan Markin listens to one such broadcast through the crackle of a field radio. He is 23 years old, a hunter from the forests near Bryansk, and he has been fighting in the rubble since September. Around him, the night is lit intermittently by flares and burning oil. He presses the radio close to his ear, the cold biting into his fingers. My dear Mitzi, I do not know if you will ever see these words. We have no food. My comrades are dying. I no longer fear death, only hunger. Markin doesn't understand German, but the tone is unmistakable, the rhythm of a man's last confession. His spotter, a university student from Leningrad, translates roughly, whispering the words between breaths. When the broadcast ends, the sniper exhales and mutters, "Even their letters are freezing." That night, he sights a German officer through his scope, a man inspecting trenches along the opposite line, his fur collar white with frost. He waits, patient and still. When the officer bends over a map, the sniper fires once. The officer falls, and Markin lowers his rifle. When the Soviet infantry retrieves the body, they find not only a pistol and a compass, but also a leather-bound diary, larger than a soldier's, the kind kept by staff officers. Inside, neat handwriting marches across lined paper, operations notes, weather logs, and then something more. A signature. Generalleutnant Hans von Helldorf, 384th Infantry Division. And under that, several pages written in code, the shorthand of a field commander. Markin turns the book over, brushes off the ice, and passes it to his unit commander. Within hours, the diary is on Shalubsky's table. When Shalubsky opens the general's diary 2 days later, he understands instantly what he holds. This is not the fevered scrawl of a starving private. This is a strategic mind documenting collapse from above. The entries begin dryly with reports on logistics and movements. Morale remains moderate despite poor rations, enemy artillery active in the northern sector. But as the days pass, the tone shifts. On December 10th, Helldorf writes, "Rumor persists that Führer contemplates strategic withdrawal from the Don Bend. Such talk forbidden, yet officers whisper it nonetheless." Shalubsky reads the line twice, underlines it in red pencil, and sits back in his chair. Around him, the air feels charged, electric. He knew, Shalubsky murmurs, he knew the retreat was being planned, but no one was allowed to speak of it. The next pages are more explicit. Notes about broken communications, the failure of supply convoys, and the near mutiny of subordinate units. One entry mentions new orders from Berlin to hold positions regardless of losses, followed by an almost fatalistic remark, "If this continues, the army will be lost. Even Paulus cannot save us." For Shalubsky, the implications are enormous. If accurate, the diary confirms not just a failing army, but a contradiction inside the German command itself. Whispers of retreat, even as Hitler's orders forbade it. The political department immediately encrypts a message to Moscow. Captured diary of German General Helldorf indicates morale collapse and potential unauthorized retreat considerations within encircled 6th Army. Recommend immediate exploitation of this material for intelligence and propaganda use. That night, Shalubsky cannot sleep. Outside, snow drifts against the dugout, muffling the sound of distant artillery. Inside, the lamp burns low, and the general's diary lies open on the table like an open wound. He flips back to the first page and reads aloud the words written in steady German script. "Discipline remains, but the soul of the army is gone." The sentence stays with him long after the lamp has gone out. December 18, 1942. The front near the Don is half ash, half ice. Snow falls sideways in the wind, stinging like grit. At dawn, Soviet scouts crawl through the wreckage of a German supply column. Overturned trucks, horses frozen mid-fall, crates burst open, with their contents scattered like entrails. One crate lies split across a shallow ditch. Inside, papers, a field map, and fragments of what looks like a logbook. Its edges are charred, but the handwriting matches the diary already on Shalubsky's desk, General Helldorf's. By noon, the fragments arrive at 62nd Army headquarters, and Shalubsky assembles them on his desk like puzzle pieces. He leans close, deciphering the damaged lines through the haze of cigarette smoke. A translator sits beside him, tracing the words with a fountain pen. Directive from Führer headquarters, large-scale movement westwards, preparation of secondary defensive line near Rostov, withdrawal not to be termed retreat, but reorganization. Shalubsky freezes. Then, in a low voice, he was planning a retreat. Hitler. The translator nods, stunned. It is not just a logistical note, it's an admission, a coded reference to a planned fallback, one contradicting every public German broadcast that swore Stalingrad will stand. The major rises from his chair, pacing, his boots crunching frost underfoot. "Comrade, do you know what this means?" he says, his voice cutting through the clatter of typewriters. "The Führer himself is preparing for defeat, and yet his soldiers die here, pretending victory still breathes." That evening, a small conference gathers in a cramped, candle-lit bunker beneath a collapsed factory wall. General Vasily Chuikov sits at the head of the table, coat unbuttoned, face gray from fatigue, but eyes sharp. Around him, Shalubsky, Zyanchkovsky, and 2 intelligence officers from the Stalingrad front's headquarters. The air reeks of kerosene and wet wool. On the table lie the 2 diaries, the private's and the general's, open beside a spread of captured German maps. Shalubsky lays out his findings, his finger tapping the relevant line each time he speaks. Here, in withdrawal westwards to Rostov, and here, in reorganization of the Southern Front. These are not random notes. This is an officer recording operational intent, Hitler's intent. Chuikov leans forward, eyes narrowing. "Are we certain of authenticity?" "Yes, Comrade General. The handwriting matches other Heldorf reports found with his body. The ink, the phrasing, the call signs, all verified." A long silence fills the room, broken only by the pop of melting ice on the stove. Then Chuikov says quietly, "We will not speak of this outside command. Not yet. But Moscow must see it, immediately." Shalubsky nods. "I'll have it translated and sent tonight." He pauses, glancing down at the private's diary beside the general's. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmurs. "One man writes of hunger, the other of strategy, and yet they both knew the same thing. They were already lost." 2 days later, on December 20th, a sealed dispatch leaves Stalingrad aboard a night courier plane bound for Moscow. Inside, under wax seal and cipher code, are photographic reproductions of the captured diary pages and Shalubsky's analytical summary. His conclusion is stark. Enemy documents indicate growing realization of inevitable defeat among senior German officers. General Heldorf's diary contains explicit mention of a planned retreat from the Don Bend, in contradiction to Führer directives. Recommend psychological and propaganda exploitation to reinforce disillusion within enemy ranks. By the time the courier aircraft lifts into the dark, tracer fire arcs lazily across the horizon. Below, Stalingrad glows like a dying forge. In Moscow, 3 days later, the material lands on the desk of the Soviet Intelligence Directorate. By December 23rd, the translated excerpts reach the office of Alexander Shcherbakov, head of the main political directorate of the Red Army. He reads in silence, his breath fogging the air of the unheated room. When he finishes, he writes one word in the margin: useful. That night, radio writers at Radio Moscow begin drafting a new script for the German-language broadcast, Stimme des Friedens, the voice of peace. It opens with the sound of a ticking clock, then the voice of the announcer, calm and deliberate. From a captured German officer's diary near Stalingrad, reorganization westwards, Rostov line. The Führer prepares movement. These are not Soviet lies, these are your own words, Kameraden. While you freeze and starve, Berlin already writes your obituary. In German bunkers across the steppe, those words drift through static and snow. Some soldiers laugh bitterly, others listen in silence. A few, when the broadcast ends, cross themselves. Meanwhile, back in Stalingrad, Sergeant Markin watches the same slow disintegration unfold through his rifle scope. The German lines across the river have gone strangely still. Fewer patrols, fewer flares. One morning, he spots a white flag fluttering near a collapsed truck. A dozen German soldiers, gaunt and unshaven, emerge with hands raised. The Soviets escort them across the no-man's land, their faces ghostly in the frost. Markin approaches one of the prisoners, a young officer with hollow eyes and a bandaged hand. The man murmurs in broken Russian, "Capitulation, bitte, no more orders." Later, as the column of prisoners shuffles toward the rear, Markin pulls a folded page from his coat. A torn leaflet, one of the same that the Soviets now scatter by the thousands from aircraft and artillery shells. On it, in German, are printed the final words from Helldorf's diary. "Discipline remains, but the soul of the army is gone." Markin stares at the line for a long moment, then lets the paper drift away into the wind. By January 1943, the diary's words had traveled far beyond the battlefield. They appear, selectively edited, in Soviet newspapers, intelligence briefings, and the frontline press leaflets aimed at German troops. To the readers, the diary is anonymous, captured German generals' notes, but the message is unmistakable. Even Hitler's trusted men foresee defeat. And in Berlin, intercepted Soviet broadcasts began to circulate within German intelligence circles. Goebbels' propaganda ministry issues quiet internal memoranda denying the existence of any such diary, calling it a Soviet fabrication. Yet, among officers at the front, the denial feels hollow. They've seen the same handwriting, the same hopeless phrasing in their comrades' letters home. One sentence, copied from Helldorf's final entry, becomes whispered legend among the encircled. Der Führer führt uns nicht mehr vorwärts. Führt uns im Kreis. The Führer no longer leads us forward. He leads us in circles. At dawn, on January 31, 1943, Soviet infantry moved through the last shattered streets of Stalingrad. In the cellars and trenches, the remnants of the Sixth Army are surrendering by the hundreds. In one ruined building near the Univergam department store, Field Marshal Paulus himself sits at a desk, his face pale, his uniform immaculate but meaningless. When the Soviet officers enter, Paulus rises weakly and says, "I have no army left." Back at the 62nd Army's intelligence post, Shalubsky receives the news quietly. He lights a cigarette, the smoke curling around the stack of diaries on his desk. The privates, the generals, and dozens more found since. Each is a story of collapse written in a different hand. He opens Helldorf's final page once more. The last sentence is smudged, barely legible, but he can still read it. "The ice will cover us soon. Perhaps it is better so." Shalubsky closes the book and mutters, "History always leaves its handwriting." Outside, the wind carries the distant echo of surrendering voices. The Soviets escort them across the no-man's land, their faces ghostly in the frost. Markin approaches one of the prisoners, a young officer with hollow eyes and a bandaged hand. The man murmurs in broken Russian, "Capitulation, bitte, no more orders." Later, as the column of prisoners shuffles toward the rear, Markin pulls a folded page from his coat, a torn leaflet, one of the same that the Soviets now scatter by the thousands from aircraft and artillery shells. On it, in German, are printed the final words from Helldorf's diary. "Discipline remains, but the soul of the army is gone." Markin stares at the line for a long moment, then lets the paper drift away into the wind. By January 1943, the diary's words had traveled far beyond the battlefield. They appear, selectively edited, in Soviet newspapers, intelligence briefings, and the frontline press leaflets aimed at German troops. To the readers, the diary is anonymous, quote, "Captured German generals' notes," end quote. But the message is unmistakable. Even Hitler's trusted men foresee defeat. And in Berlin, intercepted Soviet broadcasts began to circulate within German intelligence circles. Goebbels's propaganda ministry issues quiet internal memoranda denying the existence of any such diary, calling it a Bolshevik fabrication. Yet among officers at the front, the denial feels hollow. They've seen the same handwriting, the same hopeless phrasing in their comrades' letters home. One sentence, copied from Helldorf's final entry, becomes whispered legend among the encircled. Der Führer führt uns nicht mehr vorwärts, führt uns im Kreis. The Führer no longer leads us forward, he leads us in circles. By dawn on January 31st, 1943, Soviet infantry moved through the last shattered streets of Stalingrad. In the cellars and trenches, the remnants of the Sixth Army are surrendering by the hundreds. In one ruined building, near the Uniform department store, Field Marshal Paulus himself sits at a desk, his face pale, his uniform immaculate but meaningless. When the Soviet officers enter, Paulus rises weakly and says, "I have no army left." Back at the 62nd Army Intelligence Post, Shelulubsky receives the news quietly. He lights a cigarette, the smoke curling around the stack of diaries on his desk. The privates, the generals, and dozens more found since. Each is a story of collapse written in a different hand. He opens Helldorf's final page once more. The last sentence is smudged, barely legible, but he can still read it. "The ice will cover us soon. Perhaps it is better so." Shelulubsky closes the book and mutters, "History always leaves its handwriting."
Outside, the wind carries the distant echo of surrendering voices. February 3rd, 1943. The city of Stalingrad is no longer a city. It's a carcass of smoke and frost, a monument to exhaustion. The snow has turned black from soot. Dead tanks stand like skeletal beasts in the drifts. Among the ruins, Red Army patrols move in silence, stepping over frozen bodies through the remains of trenches that once roared with machine gun fire. Major Alexander Shelulubsky walks through this silence with a briefcase clutched to his chest. Inside are the diaries, the privates, the generals, and dozens of smaller notebooks, folded letters, and photographs taken from pockets of the fallen. Each carries a voice, each a small echo of how the war looked from the other side of the rifle. He stops near a shattered German staff car. Its windshield is blown out, its doors half buried in snow. On the back seat lies another diary, its cover scorched but intact. The ink inside has run, but two words remain clear in bold handwriting. Stalingrad ended here. Stalingrad ends here. Shelulubsky pockets the diary, not as evidence this time, but as a reminder. Inside the newly established Soviet intelligence quarters at the western edge of the city, the atmosphere is half triumph, half disbelief. The 62nd Army has won what history will later call the turning point of the war. But for those who lived it, the victory feels like a wound that still bleeds. In a dim, smoke-filled room, officers gather around a table stacked high with the spoils of surrender. Binders, field logs, orders, and personal notes taken from the pockets of thousands of prisoners. The air hums with the crackle of the iron stove. Shelulubsky stands before them, a sheaf of typewritten translations in his hand. "These diaries," he begins, voice hoarse from days without sleep, "will speak louder than any report or broadcast. They are not propaganda. They are testimony. Every word in them shows the truth. Hunger broke them, fear ruled them, and their commanders lied to them until the end." He flips to the marked page from General Helldorf's diary and reads aloud, "Orders from Führer headquarters forbid all mention of withdrawal. Morale collapsing. I see no purpose in further resistance." Then he turns to the private's final entry, dated December 18, 1942. "We are abandoned, The snow covers our bed. There is no command, only cold. The room is silent except for the crackle of firewood. Even the clerks, their pencils poised mid-air, stop writing. "Comrades," Shalubsky says quietly, "let these words tell the story of what happened here, not only to us, but to them." Days later, Moscow receives the compiled Stalingrad Diary Report, stamped Top Secret, for Comrade Stalin's review. The packet contains translated excerpts, psychological assessments, and Shalubsky's commentary. Stalin reads it in silence, tracing one line with his finger. The Führer plans withdrawal, but forbids the word. He sets the paper down and remarks to his aide, "Even the devil fears the truth." By mid-February, the diary's excerpts are adapted into press articles, educational pamphlets for soldiers, and even school lessons about the moral bankruptcy of fascism. A series of front-page Pravda columns under the headline "Voices from the Frozen Cauldron" reprints translated passages alongside editorials declaring, "The Wehrmacht's defeat at Stalingrad was not only a military collapse, it was a collapse of faith. These diaries show what no general speech could hide. The German army did not lose its weapons first. It lost its soul." Meanwhile, in Berlin, the aftermath is a different kind of silence. The Ministry of Propaganda moves swiftly to contain the fallout. Goebbels orders the confiscation of all soldier correspondence from the Stalingrad front. The German public is told that communication has been temporarily disrupted. Newspapers print the same lie. Paulus continues to resist heroically. But the truth leaks through. Intercepted Soviet broadcasts, quoting the same words from Heldorf's diary, circulate in whispers among soldiers on the Eastern Front. Copies of Soviet leaflets appear in German barracks as curiosities. Even Wehrmacht officers in the rear begin to admit privately that something irreversible has broken. In the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler reads the reports with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He refuses to accept that the Soviets possess an authentic general's diary. Forgery, he spits, Judeo-Bolshevik invention. But his adjutant notices the slight tremor in the Führer's hand as he turns the page. The handwriting is too precise, too military to dismiss outright. Back in Stalingrad, Sergeant Ivan Markin, the sniper who first recovered Heldorf's diary, receives orders to escort a captured German convoy to a holding camp on the outskirts of the city. The prisoners march slowly, wrapped in blankets and rags, faces hollowed by hunger. Among them, Markin notices one man carrying a makeshift notebook bound in cloth. He asks the interpreter, "What's that he's holding?" The prisoner, a young clerk, replies softly in German, "It's my diary, for my wife, so she knows I was still human." Markin hesitates, then gestures for the man to keep it. "Right," he says quietly. "Maybe one day someone will read yours too." The prisoner nods. For a brief moment, there's something like understanding. Two soldiers on opposite sides of the same abyss, both haunted by the same kind of memory. Spring 1943. The ice melts. The Volga runs again. The ruins of Stalingrad begin to smell of earth instead of ash. Amid the reconstruction, the diaries collected from German soldiers are archived in Moscow under the title Documents of Moral Collapse. Historians will study them for decades, dissecting each word for insight into the mind of an army that followed orders, even when reason had already surrendered. But for Shalubsky, the memory is personal. In his memoirs years later he writes, "I realized something in that winter. War can silence guns, but not handwriting. The words of the enemy became our proof that they too were afraid, that they too understood the end before it came." He keeps one artifact on his desk until the day he retires, the small leather diary of an unnamed German private. Its final words, still legible beneath stains of smoke and mud, read, "We are dying, but I still dream of spring." He closes the book and writes one final note on the inside cover. Dreams outlive orders. Outside, the rebuilt city of Stalingrad hums with life again. Children running past tank husks,
trains whistling across bridges that once marked the edge of ruin. The snow has melted, but the words remain, sealed forever in the archives. Proof that even in a war of steel and ideology, the quietest weapon of all was ink on paper.